Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Ted Halstead. I'm the founding president and CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today for what is actually a historic event. The reason why I say historic is because today represents the first time that Republican leaders are putting forth a clear and market-based climate solution. And these aren't just any conservative leaders. As you know, what we have today is a who's who of the Republican establishment, including 3 former secretaries of Treasury, 2 former secretaries of state, and 2 former Republican chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. I'm also delighted that as another co-author of our report, we have the former chairman of Walmart, the world's largest private employer. So together, this is quite a group to put forward this plan. Today also marks the formal launch of the Climate Leadership Council, a group that you will be hearing a lot more from in the months ahead. Before turning to our plan, I want to spend a couple moments on 2 topics. One is the realities of climate change, and the other is our overly polarized partisan politics on this particular issue. So let me start with the realities of climate change. I think we can summarize with 3 basic facts where we stand, and the point I want to drive home is that the situation is so much worse than most of the public recognizes. And I will try to highlight that through 3 simple facts. These are all facts. The first fact is that the overwhelming majority of scientists and every single head of state who was at the Paris Climate Summit recently agreed that the world must limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels in order to avoid the worst consequences. So that 2 degrees of warming is the clear international, widely agreed upon red line. The second fact is that on our current course, it is nearly impossible that we will stay within that red line. The best studies indicate that even if all countries abide by their Paris commitments, which is now, as we all know, very much in doubt, but even if they did abide by those commitments, temperatures would still warm by approximately 3.7 degrees by the end of this century, or nearly double the red line. The best study on this is by MIT, but there are numerous that come up with that figure of 3.7 degrees. The final fact that I would point out is that all of the evidence that the whole world now sees of climate change, meaning the melting ice caps, the record temperatures every year, the regular flooding in Miami Beach, these are all the result of what is so far 1 degree of warming. So if you think about this, we are now at 1 degree of warming, but by the end of this century, if we continue on our current course, we're heading towards 4 degrees of warming. And just to put this in very personal terms, that is within the lifetime of those who are already born today. I have a young daughter who is almost 2 years old. She will be approximately the age of Secretary Baker at the end of this century. So which means she'll be very young at the end of this century. And the reason I point that out is that, this is not some distant future problem. This is a very real current problem. Okay, so despite the urgency of this issue and the importance of addressing it, for so long this issue has been mired in partisan politics. The simplistic view is that Democrats want to solve climate change and Republicans don't. Well, as today's statement, our statement, proves that is not true. But actually, the truth is more complicated and more nuanced. And much of the mischaracterization of climate politics in America comes down to, in my opinion, a confusion between means and ends. What I mean by that is that there is widespread agreement among many and probably most Republicans that we want a healthy climate for our children and for our grandchildren. The ends are really not in doubt. By contrast, what makes Republicans so uncomfortable with climate policy and politics is the heavy-handed regulation that Democrats and the Green left consistently push as the main climate solution. From a Republican point of view, that heavy-handed regulation is growth inhibiting, and it undermines the competitiveness of American firms. But what's changed in the last 2 weeks is that Republicans are now in charge of both the White House and of Congress. So they no longer have to fear the command and control agenda of Democrats or of Greens. Rather, they can focus on a conservative climate solution, and that, of course, is where we come in. Our strong message to Republican leaders is that just as they are finding in the case of health care, it is not enough to repeal the current programs. You also must replace those current programs with something better. And I want to point out, especially for Republicans, the politics of this are very important because repealing the Obama-era climate agenda, if that is the sole climate policy of this administration, it will be wildly unpopular. Recent polls reveal that 64% of Americans care about climate change. 71% of Americans want the country to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement, and an even larger number of Americans favor clean energy. What this points to is that the obvious strategy is one of repeal and replace. Obviously, though, Republicans want a climate solution that is built on the core principles of limited government and free markets. And as you will hear today from my fellow speakers, we believe that our plan is superior in literally every way to the Obama-era climate regulations. We call our plan the conservative case for carbon dividends, which, by the way, for the cameras in the room, anybody can find on the website of the Climate Leadership Council. We call it the conservative case for carbon dividends, but we could have called it the capitalist climate solution. Because basically it boils down to two things: getting the price signals right and then getting government out of the way. That is, in essence, our plan. As you will see in our document, it has 4 components. I will quickly summarize them. The first is a gradually rising carbon tax. The second is that 100% of the proceeds would be given back to the American people in the form of dividends. And we say in our paper that they would be quarterly dividends. But at our breakfast meeting, my esteemed co-author said, hey, why not make them monthly? So maybe our plan will evolve to make them monthly dividends. The third key pillar of our program are border carbon adjustments, which are intended to level the playing field, protect the competitiveness of American firms, and encourage other countries to follow suit. And then the final pillar of our program is a significant rollback of existing climate regulations. To be more specific, we believe that the majority of the EPA's current regulatory authority having to do with carbon emissions could be eliminated, including an outright repeal of the Clean Power Plan. As you will hear from my colleagues, there are many upsides to our policies, but I want to summarize it in this way. If you look at the priorities of President Trump, our plan ticks every one of his boxes. It is pro-growth, it is pro-jobs, it is pro-competitiveness, it would balance trade, and last but hardly least, it would be good for working class Americans. I will leave a lot of the details to my colleagues, but I want to focus in my last moments on 2 unexpected benefits of our policy. The first is that, according to the Department of Treasury, 70% of Americans would come out ahead under this plan. In fact, the bottom 70% of Americans would come out ahead under this plan. What that means is that 223 million Americans stand to benefit financially from solving climate change. And if you'd like to find that policy, again, you'll find that on our website, which is www.clcouncil.org. A final advantage that I want to mention, thank you. A final advantage that I want to mention is that in the last few days, we produced this study by two leading scholars in the field, one of whom is David Bookbinder is in the room over there. What we asked them to do is to compare the emissions reductions of our plan compared to the new business as usual and all Obama-era climate regulations combined. The findings are quite stunning. What it finds is that our plan would achieve nearly 3 times the emissions reductions of business as usual, which is defined as an elimination of all Obama-era regulations, which as of January 20th is probably business as usual. But more importantly, our plan would achieve nearly twice as much emissions reductions as all Obama-era climate regulations combined, which is why we believe that with our plan, the vast majority of those regulations could be safely eliminated. So the final thing that this study found is that with our plan and our plan standing by itself, America could meet the commitments that it made in Paris without any other policies. That is how effective the power of a market-based solution can be. So to conclude, this is a plan where all Americans can come out ahead, and that is why we believe that a repeal and replace strategy would be the wisest move for the Republican Party.